Hi, this is Carol Ford.
And this is Linda Groundwater.
On June 29th, 2021, it will be 43 years since the murder of Bob Crane.
A heinous crime that remains unsolved to this day.
A few weeks ago, on June 13th, 2021, the episode Autopsy, The Last Hours of Bob Crane, with Dr. Michael Hunter, premiered on Reelz Network.
I was featured in this episode as an expert on Bob Crane as one of his official biographers. In this episode of our podcast, Carol and I will provide a review of the Autopsy episode. I'll talk about my experience filming my interview, and we'll discuss in detail what the episode got right, but also what it got wrong.
We are also pleased and honored to feature in this podcast episode testimonials told exclusively to us from Bob Crane's son, Robert Scott Crane. You will hear firsthand from Scott what he thought about certain aspects of the Autopsy episode, as he provides clarity from his point of view. Scott has not granted an interview in nearly 20 years, except to us, first for our book, Bob Crane, The Definitive Biography, and now for our podcast.
You'll also hear some reflections from another source close to Bob, who's chosen to remain anonymous at this time. What you'll learn from Scott, the anonymous source, Carol, and myself is that when these types of episodes air, they might be entertainment for the general public, but to those who knew and loved Bob Crane, they can be quite painful.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy.
This is Flipside, the true story of Bob Crane.
Hi, everyone. This is Carol Ford.
And this is Linda Groundwater.
And Linda and I have an awful lot to talk about today. A couple of weeks ago, on June 13th, Reelz Network premiered an episode of Autopsy, The Last Hours of, with Dr. Michael Hunter, about Bob Crane. And Linda, tell me what it was like to film your interview for Autopsy, because I want to say thank you for doing that. Number one, television is hard. I've done it. It's really tough to have those cameras in your face as you're trying to think and trying to come up with answers that are coherent and you're worried about how you look and all of those things and how you sound. But it's also always a very sensitive subject when we talk about Bob, because we want to present him in a truthful light and not in the more scandalous and salacious light that a lot of the media choose to do. So Linda, you recorded your interview back last year, the end of last year, which is summertime in Australia.
Yeah, I can probably quite easily say among the top 5 most terrifying moments of my life. We did it in November in a tiny little motel room after work one night. It was hot because down here in Australia in November, we're already getting into summer. And the air conditioner in the hotel room made noise, so they turned it off and then left these giant lights in this tiny little room. And I was being interviewed by some fella on a laptop in England while I sat in this tiny little chair. I felt like a T-Rex with tiny little front arms because of the way I had to keep my arms and whatnot. And it was a very unusual experience. Now, television's not really unusual to me, as in, I've been on sets and I do stage work and whatever. So the whole idea of, hold still, start this, stop that, retake, can you say that again? Make sure you say, for instance, in this case, it was, when you give us answers, can you say Bob as often as possible instead of he, because we're going to be editing. And, those things are not unusual to me, but I spent a lot of time correcting. And my greatest fear after leaving that and then not seeing the show for 7 months after that, it had time to just fester. What if I said something wrong? What if they took something I said out of context? What if I didn't do well enough? All these what ifs that come up. And in addition to all the what ifs, there was the whole idea that they were presenting me with questions that I had to take some time to say, I don't know where you got that from, but it's wrong. Gee, where did you get that? No, that's not right. no, this isn't quite the way it happened. You've got that a little backwards. It was about 2.5 hours of solid question and answer, except for the moment when I said, can we please stop for a minute so I can wipe my face because I'm dripping? Like, it was that hot in that room, which didn't help, when somebody's sitting there asking you these deep-seated questions and you don't want to get them wrong and you're working from memory, and that's all fine. Like, they were lovely people. They were actually quite nice. They said, look, if you want to stop or start something over again or whatever, just say so. And that was all fine. But what was important to me when we agreed to this was, and I spent a good hour on the phone with the producer in England before I gave her a final okay, was I said, I'm not going to sugarcoat, but I'm not going to let you get away with the rubbish either. The stuff that people think they know. I said, if something is wrong, I'm going to tell you it's wrong. And to their credit, they were quite open to that. And as I said when we were talking the other day, and I said to both Scott and to some others, was that they asked me a few things that made me worry. Information that, and I won't go into now because it'll just be fodder otherwise, but things they asked me that I thought, wow, that is so far off base, it's ridiculous. And somebody had presented those ideas to them as fact. And so I said, I don't know where you got this. There was one really big one. And I said, I don't know where you got this, but it's way off. And one other bit that I corrected, and to the show's credit, they didn't use either side of it. And so from the setup of the show, my impression was that they didn't feel comfortable leaving out their thoughts completely or someone else's thoughts completely, but they weren't going to openly say anything because I had clearly told them that something was different from what they were originally told. So it was 7 months of nail biting for a show that actually didn't turn out to be too bad. I found it to be very different from most of the episodes that I had seen. But what I really appreciated was that Dr. Hunter did not treat Bob the way other people who've gotten hold of his story have treated him. I was a little worried about that during the interview because there were a few things they asked where I thought, oh, here we go.
He did treat him with a very non-judgmental and approached it from a very scientific point of view. And if you've watched the episode, you'll see the different theories being presented, which included, of course, John Carpenter, who has always been the primary suspect, but also Victoria Berry Wells, who was the actress who found Bob that morning in the apartment, and then also Bob's second wife, Patricia Olson. You'll see that they build those theories up, and almost to the point where it's like they're leading you right to that conclusion. But then what Dr. Hunter did, which I liked, was he followed the evidence and debunked the theories. And even John Carpenter, he said, I can't conclusively say that John Carpenter, based on the evidence and the scientific facts, that John Carpenter killed Bob Crane. It's following the evidence. It's not just making a case based around who you think you want the murderer to be. And so that was different from a lot of the shows that have come out over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. Very scientifically based. I mean, that's what that show is supposed to be.
Yes.
It did go off in other directions that I didn't expect it to. Yep. And you and I have spoken about this at some length. And maybe it's because there is video available and there are lots of photos available. But I was actually quite surprised at the graphic nature of what they were showing. The discussion of the way the crime scene was treated was important, but I didn't need to see the medical examiner doing what he was doing. I didn't need to see the videotape of them coming into the room with Bob. A simple photo would have sufficed. It has certainly sufficed for others. And there is a bit of sensationalism there, I think. But again, I really appreciated that Dr. Hunter discussed Bob's interest in sex as what it was, which is an addiction. It was here's a guy who has an addiction, and this addiction works like other addictions in that it impacts the same chemical areas of the brain and this and that. And that was all quite scientific, quite straightforward, definitely no judgment there at all. And that was just such a huge relief. I was actually afraid that I was going to end up being considered part of a show that just then went and did more of the same. And although there are some things that they got wrong, and there was a surprising to me, based on comparison to other episodes, a surprising diminishing of the amount of psychological background on this one, whereas there's usually a lot more of the psychologists that they usually have. There was a lot less involvement in her than there is normally. But at the same time, they just treated Bob's sex addiction as an addiction. And I was so relieved when that happened.
Absolutely. And, you don't just become addicted overnight. This was something that Bob didn't just fly out to Hollywood and go crazy with. He had been having these types of sexual encounters all the way back into the early 1950s when he was in Connecticut. Back then, was it an addiction? Probably not. It was what some people would call a lifestyle, but it is something that over time took hold and it became like a drug. And that is what Dr. Hunter did talk about, that like a drug, like a substance, the response in your brain, it craves more and more.
Well, any substance is just the catalyst to get that activity happening in your brain. I mean, some will have side effects like you see pretty lights and colors, or everybody is cool and you get the munchies or whatever. But in reality, cocaine or LSD or whatever, I mean, they all have a purpose, and that purpose is to feel a certain way. And the feel, it isn't because you really feel like having 75 Twinkies. It's because you really want to feel the way you feel. And so any kind of addiction is aimed at changing that chemical activity in the brain, and that can come from a substance or it can come from an action. And in Bob's case, it came from an action.
Things they did not know in the 1970s, but were starting to have a better understanding of at that time. There would also not have been the public outpouring of support at that time. So everything was done very privately, very secretively, and as far as Bob seeking help for it, and as far as Bob talking about it, he didn't just go around and say, hey, I'm addicted to sex. Can somebody help me? It was all very, very quietly being handled, and people didn't know that that's what was happening at the end of his life. And then when he's murdered and his whole life is just splashed all over without any kind of understanding or perspective, it's very difficult to look at that when it's 1978 and think, oh, he's, got a sex addiction. They didn't know really what that was back then. He was just into kinky sex. And so in this regard, this program is one of the only that does take that scientific point of view, looks at the psychological aspects of it, is non-judgmental. Now, they got a lot of things right. Linda, thanks to you for that. I will always and forever give you kudos for going on. Good job. Good job.
Thank you. Well, look, for people who read the book, or even if they haven't and they've just picked up on the podcast or heard other interviews that we've done, we haven't done television because we very carefully chose to, in the past, somebody wants to interview us about the book. Somebody wants to interview us about Bob. And the whole show is about the different aspects of Bob's life or work or whatnot. And as we know, oftentimes they'll have us back 2 or 3 times because they find it's a much bigger topic than they thought. And we've done what was supposed to be an hour-long interview and turns out to be, 2 or 3 parts of an hour each. But we decided at some stage that we have done all of that. The book is out there now. It's almost 6 years old. Good grief. But it's time for us to say it's not enough that it's out there. We need to start correcting the mistakes. People aren't always going to know that the mistakes are there because we have stayed away from that. And I think this exercise was actually turned out to be quite a good example of what happens if we stand up. So there were people who have said, gee, I wish there had been more of you. I'm quite happy that there wasn't. I don't like how I look, but that's just
You're
me.
fine. You were fine.
But
You were fine.
I wish there was more, but to me, what was more important than what they actually got of me was what they didn't use, because I was there to correct the record. I take some comfort in the idea that potentially we have helped by simply making sure that we were there to tell them what things are wrong, and therefore certain things weren't used. And so it's important for us to start taking those steps, and that might be the next level, so to speak.
Okay, so some of the things that Reelz autopsy episode could have done a little bit better. One thing that sticks out to me is how they presented Victoria Berry Wells, number one, as a suspect, and number two, in the dramatization. So I'll deal with the dramatization first, then we'll tackle the suspect piece. Vicky, we talked to Vicky. She gave us a very lovely interview.
She died in 2013.
When she discovered Bob's body, she was wearing a t-shirt and jogging shorts. The way they have her made up in heels, I can't remember if they were stilettos or big chunky 70 heels or whatever, and a glittery top and looking like she just came in off of the dance floor, is not how Victoria Berry Wells found Bob Crane's body that morning. When she talked to us about it, she was broken up. We allowed her to go only to the front door when we spoke to her. We published that bit in our book. She goes to the front door, she lets herself in, but we don't allow her to go back into the apartment when we interviewed her, because she's done it so many times and because it has negatively affected her for many years. So Vicky was very, very badly affected by finding his body.
Her whole relationship with him was nothing like that.
Correct.
Nothing like that. It was Mark Dawson who said that, they believed that they were having an affair. They were not having an affair. He did approach her. She turned him down, and he became like a father figure to her. One of my biggest memories from that conversation, and she was just a lovely, delightful woman to speak with, was that she became ill.
Yes.
She got the flu or a cold or whatnot, and Bob went to the pharmacy and brought her chicken soup and cough medicine and all of these. He just treated her no differently when she said no.
He did not treat her differently in that he didn't treat her negatively, but he treated her differently in that he never approached her again or considered her to be someone that he could have sex with or photograph or videotape or whatever. He looked at her as someone who that was off the table. And because she was so much younger, in that she was not his age, he was in his 40s, throughout their acting career together on stage. She was in her 20s?
20s.
Yeah. He became kind of a father figure to her, and she told us as much in the interview that he kind of just took her under his wing. And I remember she was so excited and proud of the fact that when she got the great reviews, she had it mounted on a walnut plaque in the paper, and she's like, he called her up and said, there's this little itty bitty part, but here's the review, and you did so wonderfully, and she said, I couldn't believe it for this little itty bitty part, and he was proud of her for that, for her
and
role.
He respected her position.
Yes.
And he was trying to help her. The reason she went and was the one who found him was, she went there because he had missed a lunch, but they were supposed to get together to work on scene work and get ready for another thing that they were doing. And while I remember it, one of the things that Scott told us recently this week was that, yes, there were photos of Victoria in Bob's collection because Bob would take a picture of everything and anything. He said, but there were no naked photos. There were no provocative photos. There were just photos. As we've always said, it took pictures of everything and recorded everything, and that was part of it. But there was nothing that suggested anything that Victoria was in any way involved with Bob other than as a co-worker and friend. And that is something that was strongly suggested on the show by one of the interviewees, not by the makers of the show. Of course, they wouldn't know one way or the other, but that was something that I believe it was Mark Dawson said, oh, they were having an affair. They were not having an affair.
No, they were
They were
not.
not having an affair.
And that said, Victoria Barry Wells as a suspect loses steam, and Dr. Hunter does debunk that theory in the episode. But then there is the thing about, well, maybe it was her husband, or, you know, a man that she was with, and, you know, maybe was jealous. But that loses steam too, because of the fact that then she would have been unemployed, and Vicky needed to be employed, and not having Bob alive, she would have then been unemployed. There was talk about him replacing her with another actress in the scene work that she was supposed to be recording that morning or that day. And that loses weight too, because in Bob's date book, he actually has written video with Vic, meaning Victoria Barry. I think it's important right now to let Scott talk. So we're going to introduce Scott here and let him tell you what his thoughts are on this whole thing with Victoria Barry Wells.
I've never seen photos to suggest that they had an affair. My mom didn't think they had an affair, but she assumed that they hooked up. There were photos of everyone that he hooked up with, and she's not in them. There are photos of her, but not in that way. So probably not. But yeah, you know, she talked about how she absolutely loved him and stuff like that as type of a father figure, and they were close friends and all that.
Now, we're going to move from Victoria Barry Wells and talk about theater.
This is definitely a Dawson statement. He wanted to get into dinner theater really badly because he wanted access to the public and women. Well, no, he wanted to pay the bills, and he's always said that. And the show does say in the beginning, or someone said, dinner theater was beneath him. I think it was actually Hook that said that.
Victoria Barry told us that too, that it was a step beneath him.
It is. It's a step down. Dinner theater in those days was a step down.
It was a step down, but it was also a way for actors to work.
Well, it's like
when they were on
like
hiatus.
Scotty said, he kept working.
It wasn't just Bob Crane out there. Everybody was out there. And so it was a step down in that it's not a major motion picture. It's not a major television series, but it's a way to make money. When actors were off season, they would do dinner theater to pay the bills.
Pay the bills. Yep. It's different now. You do theater because it's a thing to do. But in those days, it was done for money. And people loved it.
That doesn't mean that Bob didn't pick up women doing dinner
but that's
theater.
not why he wanted to be in it.
Bob wanted to be a serious actor. He started acting in 1959 in community theater in Los Angeles, in Hollywood. And he would plug his plays on KNX. And it would usually be with tongue in cheek with, my 3 listeners might show up, 2 might actually stay awake, kind of thing. But he was serious about becoming an actor, and KNX knew it right out of the gate, which is why they put a no acting clause right in his 5-year contract, which did not lift until 1961. And that's when you start seeing him showing up in television. But he was doing theater, community theater, which there was no rule against him doing that. It wasn't professional. It wasn't paid. And so he could do community theater. So he envisioned himself as the next Gig Young or the next Jack Lemmon. So it wasn't, I'm getting into theater to pick up women. I'm getting into theater because I want to act. There just happened to be women when he traveled who he got involved with.
And Scott has a fair amount to say about that as well, because Hogan's Heroes was over, and then there was the letdown because they weren't expecting Hogan's Heroes to be over. So scramble, scramble. I've got alimony. I've got kids to raise. I've got bills to pay. I need to be making money. So off Bob went and worked. And Scott has a bit to say about that as well. Let's just let him talk.
When Hogan was off season, he was doing plays at the Pasadena Playhouse, San Diego Playhouse, Chicago Playhouses. No, the whole time Hogan's was on. He was an actor. He liked to work. He liked to act. That's what actors do. He was doing plays when he was on KNX before Hogan's. That's what actors do. They act. Maybe Mark's dad didn't do that, but that's what actors do.
The focus that they seemed to have, or that Mark seemed to have, was that In particular, he was looking forward to theater because he could meet women.
Huh.
As if,
Is that why Richard did Family Feud and kissed everyone? Because that seemed to be a really great way to meet women. Just kiss them on TV without asking. Oddly, my dad turned down Family Feud and said, give it to Richard. Richard was out of work after Hogan's, and my dad did not want to do game shows except as a guest. He didn't want to be a game show host, and he was offered the Family Feud role, and he turned it down, which was a mistake, obviously. But he turned it down and said, give it to Richard. So that's the true history there. So while they didn't exactly get along that great on set, Bob and Richard, Bob still threw him a gig. And Bob had Richard on his radio show back before Hogan's when Richard was a struggling comedian. So Bob always tried to help Richard out. I don't think Richard was as kind back. I don't think he paid that forward. So Mark Dawson owns his whole life to my dad, actually. Bob was basically bankrupt. He was living paycheck to paycheck. He was doing episodes of Love Boat. He was doing anything he could to pay the bills. He was literally doing a ribbon cutting ceremony at a Safeway in El Segundo for $500. It wasn't for the fame that you get from doing that. It's an embarrassing gig. It's an embarrassing gig to cut the ribbon at a Safeway in El Segundo. It just is. But he was doing it because it was $500, which was a lot of money in 1978 for 20 minutes worth of work. It's not a Stars gig. It's just not. The syndication money for Hogan's didn't kick in until about 1982. We suddenly had all these local tiny stations that used to be used for, local ads or local news. And suddenly they had a lot of programming they need to fill. And in 1981 or 2, they started buying up the syndication rebroadcast rights for shows like Gilligan's Island and Brady Bunch and Hogan's Heroes and just playing them nonstop. And that's when the money actually kicked in.
one of the things that the show said, and this came from the narrator of the show, it didn't come from a specific person. And so I'm not sure who they may or may not have gotten it from. However, they did say when Bob was in school, he loved the attention, especially the girls.
Wrong.
The same way that they said when Bob had his show, he interviewed all the starlets. But never Danny Kaye and Jerry Lewis and Alfred Hitchcock and, Shelley Berman and everyone else. They focus. Bob did not aim for attention in school. As a matter of fact, Bob didn't care about attention in school as long as he could have his drum set. And then along came Ann. And then Bob had eyes for Ann. And that was it. So was he well liked in school? I mean, gosh, Carol, you've spent so much time with the class of 46. You could tell more than almost anyone.
They loved him. He was quiet. I'm trying to remember if it was Charlie Zito or Edwin Gordon who said, when we asked as far as, would Bob have been like Hogan? Because, when we would ask questions, we would say, how much of Colonel Hogan was Bob? Was he 50% Hogan? Was he 90% Hogan? But I think it was Charlie who said to me that if that had been Bob in real life, Bob would not have been like Colonel Hogan, in that Colonel Hogan's the leader of this ragtag operation, and he's out there risking his life every day, and he's in this POW camp and danger all around, and he's always in the commandant's face, making jokes and pushing and stuff. And Charlie said that if that had been real life, Bob would have been kind of just hanging in the back away from all of that. He was not going to be a troublemaker. He was non-confrontational. He was not going to be the one out in front of everybody saying, look at me, look at me. He was going to be more laid back, more in the background. Now, if any of you know any drummers are very flashy, and Bob was a very flashy drummer. And being a drummer, you are kind of the star of the show. My brother-in-law, when we were in school, he was a drummer, and he had T-shirts. The drum line had T-shirts made up that said, I'm not in the band, I'm in the drum line. So drummers are a breed of their own, and they do stand out, but that doesn't make them extroverts, I guess would be the right word.
Well, you can hide behind drum.
Bob was not looking at the attention. He wasn't seeking the attention. He just wanted his drums. He wanted Ann. He wanted to get out of school. He graduated from high school, but he wanted to get out of school, get out of Stamford High School, and start his life. And he had his eyes set either on being in a big band, and then when that didn't work out, he went towards radio because that's where the music was. But if you know any radio DJs, a lot of them are introverted and they're talking, and people, I think it was Paul Peterson who said, you're in a room of one. You might be talking to thousands of people, but you're only talking to the microphone and you can't see all those thousands of people. So, while it may look and seem like extrovert behavior, it's really not in a lot of cases, not all, but in a lot, and certainly not for Bob.
A couple of things that we can probably very quickly skim through. We're just breaking down this show, what they got right, what they got wrong. The idea of how they condensed his career to make it sound like he went from 0 to 100 in 6 months. After, I quote, a couple of guest appearances on Dick Van Dyke and the Donna Reed show, he launched into Hogan's Heroes. Like, he'd been acting for years, as we've said before, doing a lot of actual theater. So his breaks were on the Donna Reed show and the Dick Van Dyke show. But he'd been doing other shows. He'd done a couple of movies, little bits and pieces, but he had done these things and he was taking acting lessons. And so it wasn't like he suddenly became Colonel Hogan and where did this guy come from? He'd been in radio for years. And by the way, he didn't suddenly become a big radio personality when he got to Los Angeles. He was already a big radio personality. He wasn't known in Los Angeles because he was working on the East Coast and they didn't do nationally syndicated programming for him, but he was very well known on the East Coast. That's how he got onto the West Coast because they needed to get rid of him. So we just want to clarify here for those who may not have known these things that he sounds like one of these Lana Turner discovered at the soda fountain, didn't you go from 0 to superstar overnight? It didn't happen that way.
Yeah, and when you say get rid of them, you're talking about WEEI in Boston, who was tanking in ratings, and Bob was killing them in the ratings at WICC in Bridgeport, Connecticut. Yes. And so they needed to get him out of the Bridgeport market. And so they offered him the job at EEI up in Boston, and he didn't want to get locked into a contract. So they turned him down. In the meantime, out in LA, Ralph Story was leaving KNX to do the $64,000 question. And so they needed to replace him for their morning drive. And so KNX thought, well, we can kill two birds with one stone. We can get him out of the New England market away from WEEI in Boston, which will help EEI's ratings, bring him out to the West Coast because he has such a great show on the East Coast, and bring him out to LA, set him up for the drive time at KNX, replacing Ralph Story. So it wasn't just he suddenly appeared in Los Angeles and was this overnight sensation. In fact, it took a good couple of years for Southern California to get used to him because Ralph Story was so much more subdued and more of a storyteller, and you woke up to more of a grandfatherly or fatherly type voice, kind of lulling you awake from a, night's sleep, whereas Bob was much different, shattering glass and jolting people out of bed at 6 o'clock in the morning. So it took a little while for him to prove himself even out West. But he had already established that he was a force to be reckoned with because on the East Coast, he had discovered he had a way he was going to do his show. And if he couldn't do it that way in LA, he wasn't going. And it almost led to a union strike because he wanted to play his own records. So they went into negotiations. And so there was all of this stuff. Of course, they, got a deal, and Bob did make it out to LA because everything was in place. Was it meteoric for general sense of 1950 to 65? We've got 15 years where he does go on this super trajectory, but it doesn't happen overnight. And there is a climb to get there. There's a lot more steps in there than just suddenly he's showing up at KNX.
And even the 6 years from 1950 to 1956, that's a heck of a slow trajectory.
Absolutely, yeah.
By comparison. It's not a slow trajectory in general, but it's certainly slow by comparison to, he became a big hit on the West Coast, and then he had a couple of guest shows, and then he was off to superstardom. It's like, hey, hang on.
They say he guest starred on Donna Reed. He guest starred on Dick
Yeah.
Van Dyke and Donna Reed, and no, he didn't guest star on on Donna Reed. He had a supporting role in it for a couple of years. He learned from Donna Reed, and this is a topic for a whole nother episode, but he learned from her. She encouraged him to take acting classes. He took an acting class by Stella Adler. And he also had the people in the industry. There's really quickly the story that he never was the number one DJ in LA. That always went to Dick Whittinghill. He always came in second to Dick Whittinghill, but that was just based on the fact that Dick Whittinghill was the familiar voice in the morning. But what Bob had, and he had phenomenal ratings, but he also had the industry people. So he was having all of these people from the big band era, to producers, to directors, to musicians, to actors, to actresses. He had his thumb on the industry, which then he was using to get doors opened for him once the no acting clause was lifted. So once the no acting clause was lifted, he was able to go out and talk to Carl Reiner and kind of say, the story goes that he begged to be on Dick Van Dyke. Donna Reed was on his show. There were so many people on his KNX show. So he had the industry people. He had the inside hook in the industry people. And it wasn't just starlets, not by any means. So another thing that they talked about was Bob's connection to the mob. And Linda, you mentioned in the episode that, and Vicki had told us in her interview as well, which is why you mentioned it, that Scottsdale's a mob town and Bob had reservations. He didn't like it. If you were in the witness protection program, this is where they sent you. So just talk a little bit about how that answer came up and why you elaborated on the mob in the episode.
Well, at some point they said to me, who do you think did it? And as you and I and our regular listeners know, we do not expound upon those theories. We know what all the theories are. Matter of fact, I wrote down a list of about 7 or 8 theories. And among those theories was that it was a mob hit. And I think that that's fairly well been discounted simply by virtue of the fact that it was clearly a very personal, brutal, messy murder.
And mob hits are not like
mob hits don't look like that. Mob hits don't have things done to them. When the person is dead, they're dead. And the theory was that cord had been wrapped around and tied in a bow after he died. A mob hit, they're not going to hang around and do that. They're going to make sure you're dead and they're going to go. And they're not going to take a tripod that they happen to find in the place and whack you with it. They're going to do something that they need to do. So they're going to come in prepared to do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And do it, And although Bob had no filter, he had bad judgment, and Scotty may wish to expound upon those things.
It was all interconnected. This guy, big, thick Chicago mobster type of accent, said that they had a place in either Palm Springs or Vegas or Santa Barbara that they had as like a vacation home. And it was a big mansion, and said, Bob, come out, bring your wife, bring the kids, great place. You can hang out with us and we'll have a nice time. And my dad was like, oh, fantastic. You hear about that? We can go to this big mansion out in, wherever with this family. And my mom looked at him like, are you crazy? You're going to get us killed. And within a year or two, that man that offered to invite them to their house for, to hang out, their vacation home, was machine gunned in his yard. So my mom had a better sense of reading the room than my dad did.
Your dad had no filter.
You no filter.
You said that to me once. Is that your dad had no filter. He couldn't pick between the good people and the bad people.
I don't think
he couldn't understand when he was being taken advantage of in that way, could he?
No, I don't think he was a good judge of character, which is weird for such a great interviewer, because, as an interviewer on the radio, he was so good at that. But he was really good at that, but mostly it was jokes. He wasn't even going on a Howard Stern or a Joe Rogan level of trying to get in their brain at all. Not at all. He was looking for the quick joke and the quick quip. So, he just found ways to get in there really quick. But I don't think he was psychologically analyzing the people he was interviewing at all. And he just became friends with everyone, and some of them were creeps. Like, Over and over again, he would help Richard Dawson, and Richard Dawson would basically spit in his face and make fun of him to his face. Richard was a bully on the set of Hogan's, making fun of Bob for dropping lines. And my mom or Warner or someone was like, Richard, you have 2 lines in this show. He's got like 60 pages of dialogue. What are you talking about? Yeah, he forgets a line. You have 1 line today. It's called an under 5. You're lucky to get paid. Go home. Yeah, so Richard was very jealous of him and made fun of him on the set. But Bob kept on helping Richard. Bob was friends to everybody. He was a very friendly guy.
Although Bob had knowledge of people who were in the mob, he wasn't doing anything with the mob. His theory was that if I'm not doing anything illegal, they have nothing to be mad at me for, although I think that's a very naive way of looking at the mob. They don't like you just because you're not doing anything bad. But the reason that it came up was that they said, who do you think did it? And I said, not going there, but here are all the theories. And they took that sentence and plucked it out of the air and plunked on to the end of it Bobby's comment that Bob didn't know the mob any money, and I don't know where that came from. It would have been messy or whatever. And I thought, well, couldn't have gotten much more messy than it was. But there was never a suggestion that I supported it. Just here's what. As a matter of fact, I don't support that particular theory.
Yeah, because it does come across as point counterpoint in that particular moment where you're saying, oh, well, mob, Scottsdale's a mob. And then right on the heels of that, Bobby does come in and say, oh, he doesn't owe any money. So it is set up as though it is your theory. And I think it's very important.
It is absolutely not my theory. I wasn't going to tell them my theory, but I could tell them what it wasn't. And that wasn't my theory. Although we can recall that Bob didn't want to go to Scottsdale alone.
Yes.
Pam and Johnny and Pam Thompson to go with him because he didn't, and they couldn't get out of their contract in Vegas to go with him to Scottsdale. And he would say to Vicky, "This is a mob town." She said she recalled it because he said it more than once, and he had some encounters with, because he didn't have dealings with, but he had encounters with people who were in the mob. And in the 70s, let's face it, the mob was a big deal, and they ran a lot of theaters, and and so he would have encountered them simply as owners of theaters or owners of places that he could play drums or whatever, but not to go out and do mob things. It would just be that's who those people were. But no, I don't support that theory at all, not remotely.
And while we're on the topic of theories, there are two that have, consistently risen to the top as to motive. And one is the money trail, that Bob had all this money and that the only person who could ever benefit from his death would have been Patty. And I think, and Linda, you can agree with me, that it's probably best to let Scott talk and tell his side of that because he lived it.
Absolutely. It is said during the show by a couple of the interviewees that Patty'd get everything. There was loads of money and Patty would get everything. The other family wouldn't get anything if Bob died. And that's kind of a backwards theory. Yeah, it's not accurate that Patty would be the only person who would benefit from that. And let's just let Scott talk about that. The first family, for the most part, got not much, didn't they?
Yes, that's true. But that would sting. That big Bel Air house was purchased before they were married by her with her money. So it was never Bob's. And that was part of the reason why the will was written the way it was all of the kids were now over 18 except for me. Well, and he felt like he'd been paying them for years and now they're over 18. They should get jobs. And I've got a 6 or 7-year-old who can't get a job. And I don't have any money, so anything that I do have should go to him. We had to sell her. My dad died. We had to sell our house in LA and move to Bainbridge Island, which, well, it still is. LA was a lot more expensive than Seattle. You could get a house that was a good size house on Bainbridge Island for $100,000. But the same size house in LA at that time would be $300,000, $400,000, $500,000. That was the difference in real estate prices. So we had to sell our LA house and move to Seattle and Bainbridge. One of the main reasons was the economy. There was no money. The criminal case that put Lloyd Vaughn in jail for embezzling from my dad really laid it out for the court. My dad was broke. Thanks in large part to Hogan's not paying yet in syndication, and that Lloyd Vaughn took all the money. So, because, over $1 million over the period of years. So no, that whole theory of follow the money, hell no, that's the same reason why Lloyd Vaughn did not want Bob Crane killed. It's the same reason why my mom would not want him killed, because if he was alive, he could work. If he was dead, it was done. Back then it wasn't like today with residuals and stuff like that for TV shows like Cheers or whatever, where you can essentially live forever on that money from once you get a Cheers or a Seinfeld, and you never have to work again. It was not like that at all. They didn't get those kind of benefits. That really didn't happen until Cheers and Friends and shows like that, where the stars became owners of the show or big profit participants in the show. So yeah, no, if he died, that meant there was literally no income.
The only other thing I could think of that they might have been referring to was if there was some big insurance policy. But you wouldn't have had to sell your house if there was some big insurance policy. No.
And in fact, more proof to this, I had been going to private school for obviously preschool, but then kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, I went to a very expensive private school with other stars' children or doctors and lawyers' children. And I'm not saying I wasn't a privileged kid, I was, but it was expensive. So end of second grade, my father died overnight. I had to be placed into public school, and I'd never been to public school. And public school was not a great option in LA in the 1970s. Busing had just started. And the whole theory of busing was to spread the kids around, spread the kids from poor neighborhoods into the richer neighborhoods so that they could get into the better schools. And maybe you could find some type of a middle ground by spreading the kids around. So this school that I wound up going to, public school, had been the Bel Air neighborhood school. But when busing started, Bel Air suddenly took all their kids out of this cute little neighborhood public school and put them into private school. Except for me, I did the opposite. My dad died in 78. All the money dried up. I went out of private school and into Bel Air's public school. Sounds great. It wasn't. It was actually a nightmare, because you're talking about kids that have been on a bus for an hour or two, and the final 20 minutes of their journey are looking at houses that are mega mansions, and they're coming from some of the poorest areas in America. And so I was the face of the neighborhood at school. I was like the one white kid left, and they took it out on me. So public school was really, really rough in LA in the 1970s. Everything shifted. So this whole theory of Bobby's and Dawson's that to follow the money, there was no money. I wound up having to go to public school. We wound up having to sell our house to buy a much, much more affordable house. So yeah, that's just them pointing fingers.
So the other piece is the visit from Patty and Scott over Father's Day weekend in Scottsdale, Arizona. And this has been also made up to be that Patty came in unannounced. Bob was very upset. He was furious. I think it was Bobby who said that she threw things, and, she, not specifically during that visit, but that she had a volatile temper and he had a cut lip, and things happen when you're having marital problems. You throw things. I throw things. Doesn't mean I'm a bad person. But the visit to Scottsdale has been embellished a bit. And we talk about it in the book. Both Linda and I have seen the video that Bob took of Patty and Scotty when they visited Scottsdale over Father's Day. And at some point, Scotty's going to release that, either just to us and we can share some of it with you, or he might release it in entirety and put it on his YouTube channel. But it's a precious video. Scotty presents Bob with a Father's Day gift. It's a picture of himself. Scotty is your typical 8-year-old kid bouncing off the walls. I remember he comes running right up to the camera, and he's showing he's just being a kid. In the background are his parents. And Bob is very emotionally touched by the gift, which was the picture of Scott. And Patty and Bob are very close in the video.
My
They-
most precious thought
They,
on that whole video is when he leans over and says, "I love you so much." And
Yes.
they have a beautiful, touching moment.
they have what, and I remember, my parents kissing the same way. It's the little peck on the lips. It's not dirty. It's not sexy or sensual or anything. It's an I love you kiss. And it happens only for a second. And he keeps saying, I love this. I love this. I love you. I love you. I love this. They played it at the trial for Carpenter, but that video gets downplayed. In fact, it's non-existent to most people. But it is a very telling moment of what was actually happening. We don't know if Bob and Patty were going to be successful in their reconciliation because Bob didn't live long enough. But there was the indication that they were going to attempt the reconciliation. Bob has it written in his date book. First, he's got it written on the week of July 3rd, home, in big letters, and it's underscored and an exclamation point. Yeah, he's going home. He's leaving Scottsdale. He's going back home to California, which I do that when I go on business trips. I'm excited to leave the business trip and get back home and, kick my feet up and say, okay, the business trip is done. Then he's got in two other places on July 9th, he's got written, which is a Saturday, go home. And on July 10th, you flip the page over, he's got come home. That is really telling because, as Scott has explained to us, his parents were attempting the reconciliation, and those instances in his date book were Bob's chronicling, because he chronicled everything, were his indications that not only was he going home from Scottsdale, the big home, which is scribbled all over July 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, but he's got go home on the 9th and then come home on the 10th. He is going home. He is moving back in with Patty and Scotty.
Now, they spent a few days around the Father's Day period in Scottsdale with Bob. So the video that we have seen is just on Father's Day, but they didn't get there on Father's Day. They got there before Father's Day, and they spent a fair amount of time there. Scotty reckons probably close to a week. He can't remember, as you can imagine. It's a very long time ago, but it was certainly more than a day. And they decided during that visit that they were going to definitely attempt the reconciliation and stop the legal process of separation and divorce. As Carol said, whether it was going to be successful or not, no idea. But at that stage, the decision was, we're going to try again. And the thing that really bothered me about the show was that the implication was left. And again, this was one of those times where certain things were left out, possibly because they were corrected. So it didn't concern me particularly that they didn't use my correction. I actually told them about this video. They didn't know about this video. And so they didn't say, she went on that weekend and then these horrible things happened. But what they did was they had Bobby talking about how they could be quite volatile in their arguments, and then cut to a scene of what was presumably Father's Day weekend of this actress portraying Patty screaming and throwing and whatnot at Bob, leading us to make the inference that that's what was happening in the 2 weeks before Bob was killed, when the real video is proof that that is absolutely not what was happening.
Not during that weekend. Not during
that weekend at all. And I just remember, I haven't seen that video in quite some time, so I'm actually looking forward to seeing it again, but was seeing how emotionally overwhelmed Bob was at that time. I thought he was on the verge of tears. He was so touched. He was so overwhelmed. And he, like you said, he just kept saying, I love this. I love this. He'd look at Scotty and say, I love you. And then he'd look at Patty and say, I love you so much. I love you. And she's just sitting on the arm of the chair. And he just couldn't get enough of this chance of putting his life back together. And for the show to have side by sided that commentary and that weekend was just wrong, especially since I made it a point of telling them that that video existed. And the interviewer actually said to me, how do you know about this? And I said, I've seen it. And so my thought here, and I could be wrong, but is that they made it a point of not actually saying this is what happened on Father's Day weekend, because I told them that it didn't, but they didn't do anything to dismiss that idea either. Because Bobby didn't say it happened on Father's Day weekend either.
I mean,
but they put those two things
correct.
together. And when you're a casual observer of a television show and you don't know all these little itty bitty details about someone's life, you would reasonably think that what he's talking about, oh, I saw him with a cut lip and whatever, you would reasonably think that he's talking about that weekend. And Bobby never said that.
No.
And the video doesn't say this is Father's Day weekend. It just says, oh, and they went to visit him in Scottsdale on Father's Day weekend, and put all of that around it. And I said, that's wrong. And that's exactly the way I took it. And if I hadn't known, that's exactly how I would have presumed that situation to be. And that was a big wrong to me. The only victory there for me was that they didn't actually say it.
To tag on to that, they also talk about the phone call that Bob and Patty had the night that Bob died, where Patty and Bob talked for about an hour, and that the phone records show that she was at home in Washington State when that phone call took place. Now, there were reports about the neighbors saying that Bob was yelling so badly that night that he wouldn't be able to perform the next night because he was going to have a hoarse throat. You know, he wasn't going to be able to perform. They mentioned that, not in that detail in Autopsy, but that has come up as they were having an argument on the phone. We don't know who Bob was yelling at. If there were neighbors who were saying that he was yelling, that's very possible, but we don't know if he was yelling at Patty. We don't know if he was yelling on the phone. We don't know who he was yelling at. It just was that he was yelling. And so that's important to, I think, just say he was on the phone with Patty, so he must have been yelling at Patty, but we don't know that for sure who he was raising his voice to.
Well, there's another part of that as well, which is, oh, yes, he was yelling, but he was yelling loudly, but we couldn't hear what he was saying. Okay, so are you sure you recognize his voice? Was it him that was there alone? Was there someone else there? Was he having an argument with someone in his condo? Was somebody else doing the yelling? Were they watching something? Because remember, they had a lot of homemade tapes. Was there something they were watching? And it was, I have no idea here, by the way, but all of these things of, oh, well, we heard him yelling. He was on the phone with Patty for an hour. Was he yelling for an hour? She wouldn't have stayed on the phone that long. I wouldn't have if somebody was yelling at me. And even as she said in the trial itself, she said, if somebody yells, I just get very quiet. Now, we have no idea what her side of the conversation was, of course, but Scotty was there. It just... And yes, there are phone records saying he did speak with Patty that night for about an hour. But again, who's going to be screamed at for an hour and who is going to scream for an hour? And we don't know. You know, you can say anything. Oh, we heard him screaming. Really? You could hear it, but you didn't know what he was saying. If someone's screaming, you can usually make out something.
As we're talking about Patty and Bob's marriage and separation and possible divorce, Autopsy portrayed the reason why both Anne and Patty left Bob, and that's a bit inaccurate too. Linda, could you talk about that?
There was a comment that Anne divorced Bob because she suddenly discovered that he was into photography and other women. There may have been a breaking point. There may have been a line that was crossed, but the suggestion was that she suddenly discovered this, the same way that apparently Patty suddenly had a problem. These things don't make sense.
Patty knew what she was getting when she became involved with Bob on the set of Hogan's Heroes. And Scotty can speak more to that.
They dated for years while he was married to his first wife, Anne. They dated for 4 years before they got married. They had to wait until Bob got a divorce from Ann. So at first they had a secret affair. But my mom also knew that Bob had an affair with Cynthia Lynn, the first, not Hilda, but Helga on the show. My mom knew my dad was a swinger in the 60s. Bobby here in 1979 says, in this Partner magazine article, my ex-stepmother took him to the Classic Cat on the Sunset Strip, which was a strip club back then. My ex-stepmother took him there once for his birthday, and his present was one of the strippers backstage. Really, who needs Plato's Retreat? That's an unquote from Bobby. So yeah, no, Bobby is saying there that she was fine with him having other women. I know that story to be a different story, that it wasn't her idea as a present, but she did say that they were at the Classic Cat and a stripper basically offered to take him backstage and have sex with him. And he said, "Can I do that?" And she said, "Yeah, go ahead."
Anne also had knowledge of what Bob was doing. Maybe not 100%, but she did know that he was having flings. Whatever their situation was, whatever their arrangement was, they stayed together. I do know that Bob loved Anne very much, and they did remain friends following their divorce. To say that Anne just had an epiphany one day or just stumbled in and found it is not accurate.
And for Patty, I mean, she certainly knew what he was capable of because he was cheating with Patty on Anne. And she knew about Cynthia Lynn. Yes, there were things that happened that she wasn't happy with. There were things about it that bothered her, but she loved him and she dealt with it. It wasn't that it was a sudden epiphany to either of them. And I just thought it was important that that be corrected because, again, there's that idea that he went to Hollywood and became a bad guy. And it's not true. He didn't become a bad guy. I mean, he wasn't an awesome guy messing around with every woman on earth on his wife. But, you know, these women, for whatever reason, chose to accept and or at least tolerate this behavior for whatever their reasons are. And quite frankly, they're none of our business. And
Correct.
We didn't even ask why. We didn't even try and figure it out. It's nothing to do with the reality of their relationships were that these two women loved him enough to stay with him, although they knew these things were going on. And it wasn't a sudden discovery of his secret hobby that separated Bob and Anne.
So the flat tire, on the night of June 28th, Bob finishes his last performance of Beginner's Luck. He stands in the lobby, he signs autographs with the rest of the cast. According to sources who were there, he was just his normal self. He was upbeat, he was happy, he was not any different than any other time. I want to say right here that it's important to note that in the episode, they talk about Bob being down, depressed. You know, why am I continuing to do this? I forget the actual words that they said, but it was suggested that he was very unhappy. And they spent a lot of time connecting that to his separation and impending divorce with Patty. I think it's also important to note that while that may be true, and yeah, you know, anybody would be sad and depressed about possibly going through a divorce, it's important to say that Bob's run of Beginner's Luck in Scottsdale was not going well. At least twice, he looked to replace the leading actress. Now, Victoria Barry Wells was playing the secondary actress who Bob, in the beginning of the play, if you've read the play, you know, if you haven't, I strongly suggest it because it's absolutely hilarious. But Vicky was playing the supporting actress who is only in maybe the first 15 minutes of the play, and then she's done. So she's the person, the character who Bob's character is looking to have a one-night stand with, and then it all goes wrong. He never ends up having the one-night stand, but it appears like he did, and then his wife, who is the leading actress in the play, finds out because a picture of the two of them was taken running from the bowling alley or their apartment. Because
running from the building because it
running
caught
from the
on
building,
fire.
right, with the bowling ball, running from the building because there was fire. And so the picture ends up in the paper, and his wife in the play gives him the copy of the paper where it appears on like page 2 or something like that. And so that's when his wife leaves him. And then the whole rest of the play is him trying to get back together with his wife in the play. So Vicky was fine. It wasn't Vicky's character. It was the leading actress, her character as the character of the wife. And Vicky told us, remember, Linda, that this actress was actually like even speaking to the audience during the show, that it was just a terrible performance. She was a terrible actress. She did the number one cardinal sin. And Linda, because you do stage work, you don't pander to the audience like that. You stay in character, you do your show, but you don't, do anything.
And if that's going to be done, it is done with the permission of the director.
Yeah, so for sure. And so this actress was causing him trouble. He has it written in his date book that the opening of the show was awful. I have probably the only existing complete recording, which is audio, of the opening show in Scottsdale in 1978 during this run. And on the one side, he writes disaster on the audio cassette. So he was pretty pissed in Scottsdale to begin with, because this show was not going well because of this leading actress. Now, if you are having a bad day at work, if you're in a situation at work where somebody's not doing their job, or you're struggling with some sort of client or whatever, you're going to have a bad day, and it's going to carry over for a few days. And so they make it sound like,
especially, by the way, with this kind of work. And I will tell you, because as I know from actors that I have worked with, and I hope none of them are listening to this, that if one actor causes trouble by not knowing their lines or showing up late, or I had an actor once who at dress rehearsal say, "I'm done here, I'm not going to do this anymore." And I'm like, excuse me, we open tomorrow, get in here and do your show. It affects everyone else on stage. So like, if you work in a retail store, for example, and I've done plenty of those, and there's nothing wrong with that either, by the way, I love retail. If you work in a retail store and you get one customer who just really does your head in, that'll affect you for a little while. It might affect you for half the day, but it's not going to affect the other 20 people who are working in the store. When you're on stage with with this character, it was usually just her and Bob, or her and Bob and the other lead actor, more often just her and Bob, that it is going to affect his performance, because when it's live work, you cannot stop and turn around. You have to work off of whatever it is she's throwing at you. You've got to catch it and run with it. And if she's messing around with it and she's not professional and she's breaking the fourth wall and she's going for the, for laughs for herself, as opposed to looking at the good of the show, he would be pinged. Because if there's one thing we know about Bob in his history, it is that's not the way he acted when he was on a set. He would work for the benefit of the show, and he let other actors shine. And that's clearly not what this actress was doing. And that would have impacted him very, very badly.
There were situations with this particular run of Beginner's Luck, and with Beginner's Luck, I think towards the end in general, where Bob was looking to get back into mainline television and movies and things like that. As we, talked about, dinner theater was a little bit of a step down, but it was work. But that being said, as the show was coming to an end, they were going to end the run early. The last night, Bob was in pretty good spirits. And in fact, for the last couple of weeks, Bob was in pretty good spirits because he gave an interview with a Scottsdale reporter, and he talked about how hopeful he was. There's no date on this piece. It never ran because Bob was killed very shortly thereafter. Bob was very optimistic, and he was not just like down in the dumps and, my life is over kind of thing. And perhaps Bob is the person who can best say that. And I'm going to let you listen to him, which this is an interview from Phoenix, Arizona in June 1978 where he talks about, and this is where the quote comes from at the end of our book, that no matter how bad a situation gets, there's always a pony hidden underneath all of that stuff. So here's that clip from that Phoenix interview from June 1978.
Bob, was it difficult for you personally after being on a series for so long? Once it was over, what was it like for you? Was it a difficult transition or adjustment?
Not really. There's never a point where you say, gee, this is difficult. I love life. I'm an optimist. I'm the guy that always assumes no matter what's in that room, there's a pony hidden underneath all of that stuff. I am the original guy that says that there must be a pony in there. And so what happens when the show goes off, I got a lot of offers to do talk shows, because this is what I did in radio before I ever got into television, and I was known as a talk show host. So everybody said, okay, now you'll do a talk show. And I said, no. And the years went on, and meantime I'm doing my play. I started doing Beginner's Luck 7 years ago. We did The Windmill here about 5 years ago, and I was just rewriting the play at that point and adding a lot of things to it, taking out things. And the years go by, and never once do you say, gee, I'm disappointed because another series hasn't come along. Because I did do a series about 3 years ago for NBC called The Bob Crane Show. We wanted to call it The Dick Van Dyke Show, but that was already taken. But on that show, I played a 40-year-old guy that goes back to college to study to be a doctor. Unfortunately, the series didn't become a hit. It lasted 14 weeks and over.
That was it.
But then you go on and you keep doing the dinner theaters and you keep looking for another role on television. I did Love Boat recently.
That's a funny show.
Oh, yeah. And so you're never really disappointed. You always say, one of these days, I think hope springs eternal in an actor's life. You know, you always are looking for the next thing that happens, next thing that comes along.
Coming out of the theater after that final performance, Bob and John Carpenter get to Bob's rental car, and the car has a flat. Linda, talk to us about Bob and his mechanical capabilities, and then we'll let Scotty really
that
expand
is quite
on
the
that.
Overstatement. Let's just say that Bob didn't have handyman capabilities. He wanted to. He could invent all sorts of things, but he couldn't fix things. On the way out of the theater, or on the way home from the theater that night, Bob got a flat tire. And there was discussion that it may have been done deliberately and potentially a failed attempt to get Bob in a place late at night where he could be killed. The source that at the moment prefers not to be named has said, although this knowledge has been backed up by others at this point, that anybody who knew Bob well would know that he would not change a tire. This person specifically mentioned in this case, John Carpenter, because Bob did a lot of different things with John Carpenter that were related to fixing different things, fixing cameras and video equipment and whatever, but knew that Bob was not mechanically inclined and not repair-wise inclined. And so John would have known that a tire was not going to be in the mix. So the idea that the tire was a failed attempt to do something to Bob later that night, and that's why someone resorted to that's my dog, I'm sorry, resorted to the idea of the bludgeoning, saying that the tire was the prelude to that would have been incorrect. The stories about Bob are just extraordinary. I have an image in my head of a man. Scotty told this story, but he told it in a rather lengthy fashion. I'll try to make it short because it's just in my head. They got a flat tire on the freeway at one point, and Bob dropped the keys down the grate and had to kind of dig down to get it, and tried to, duct tape and super glue kind of repair kind of thing, and stick it around a hanger and see if you could latch this thing up. And he couldn't manage he wanted to do things in a hurry and wanted to do the quick fix, couldn't do the real fix. And one day they got a flat on the freeway, back tire, driver's side, and they pulled over and was in the back of the car and dropped something and put his head down on the concrete, or on the bitumen on the freeway behind the car, where oncoming traffic could come and run over his head. He didn't know what he was doing. And anyone that knew him would have known that a tire, they said, well, would he have debated about taking it to the garage and just found it too hard? It's like, no. He wouldn't have considered changing the tire. He just wouldn't. He just wouldn't. And Scotty I call him Scotty. I probably shouldn't. He's Scott.
Yes.
But I've always known him as Scotty. But
yeah.
Scott will tell the best story I have ever heard about his father and his ability to repair things. We'll just let him go with that.
He was a fixer. He tried to fix things. He wasn't an automobile fixer. He was bad with cars, fixing them himself. He was better with fixing electronics. But even then, he was a little ham-fisted too. Like super glue was a primary tool of his in fixing things. My mom tells a story. In 1970s, TVs weighed a lot, and they were really big. They were like this deep. So my dad was in his basement studio at our house in LA, and she hears this yelling coming from downstairs. And she's like, what? And he's like, you've got to help me. And she was cooking dinner or something in the kitchen. And she's like, you got to help me. And she's like, come up here. And he's like, I can't come up there. And she's like, no, I'm cooking or whatever. I can't come down there. So my dad comes up from the basement, locking this TV where he had super glued his hands to the top of and he's like having to carry it up the stairs. He's got this massive TV. So no, super glue was his main tool. He could use a soldering iron, but if he could opt for super glue, it was much faster.
This episode in hindsight has just given us an opportunity to discuss the ups and downs of things about Bob that we may have discussed before, but in light of this episode of Autopsy, I thought it was important that we spend a little time explaining, one, how we were involved and why, what you may not have seen, but how what we did behind the scenes may have impacted what actually was shown and not shown on that episode and helped shape a little bit, which I hope and I think, based on what I was asked versus what was shown, I think it did. Appreciate that the show did not judge, and appreciate that they spent time discussing things on a scientific and physical level, which actually is the point of that show. And although they went farther than I certainly would have in terms of the graphic nature of some of the things that they showed, I get it from the viewpoint of what that show is, and appreciate that they didn't really try and sensationalize his sex addiction, but treated it as what it was. But at the same time, it's important to point out again, because this has always been our mission, what these inaccuracies may be. Now, people who watch the show casually may never hear this podcast, but somebody who might know somebody who has, it'll give them an opportunity to go, hey, you know what? He really didn't just appear on Hogan's Heroes. He did theater all the time. He did radio here. He didn't have an affair with this woman, or he did approach that woman, or whatever. And I think it's just given us that opportunity to review a few different things, which might make it a little scattered, but which, the show just gives us the opportunity again to clear up again a few more things that still get gotten wrong.
We would like to end this with a clip from Scott that he told us that happened on the day before his father died. And what this will give you a little insight into is how badly Bob's death affected his children and his family and his friends. But this is from Scotty and his little friend. They were having a little birthday party, and we'll let him tell you.
The police told my mom at the time of the murder, we were again on Bainbridge Island. I, the next morning, was playing in the rental house's yard with still a dear friend of mine, named Katie. We were playing in the front yard when my mom got the call from the police that said that my dad had died. And I was watching through my window, or from the yard into the house to the window, and I saw my mom on the phone crying. And I just knew somebody died. And I thought maybe it was my dad, because I had seen 2 years earlier, we were in Chicago doing a play on the road, my mom and my dad and me. We were in the hotel, and my dad got the call that his dad had died. And we were in Chicago. And I remember it was like one of those suite apartments where, there's some French doors that closed. And my mom and my dad were in this like living room part, and I was playing in the bedroom. But I could see through the doors that they were crying. And it was intense. And when I went outside to see what was going on, to ask them what was going on, they said that my grandpa, Bob's dad, had died. So I never saw that kind of intensity on the phone again until that morning. And I saw my dad's shock and my mom's shock and tears. And I thought, oh, somebody died, most likely my dad, because of how upset she was. So I can tell you we weren't in Scottsdale on June 29th. So can Katie, my dear friend. And I found these color slides from, I think, the day before my dad died, of us playing in the yard. We were both had huge smiles on our faces, and we looked so happy. And it hit me. I looked at this photo, and I was like, oh my God, that was the last time I was a kid. I lost all my innocence after that day.
I want to thank everyone for listening today. I hope that we have, as Linda said, given you a little bit deeper insight into not only the production of this episode, but also some of the things that were presented in it. And that you can, again, look at things with a more critical eye and a little bit more critical thinking than what some of these shows present in the hour, what boils down to about 45 minutes when it's all said and done, because there's always so much more to the story.
It's always gratifying and humbling to have people who love Bob, and I say love in the present tense, and who knew Bob, trust us with their stories and their love and their knowledge. And so we really want to specifically thank Scott, and someone who shall not be named at this point, and everyone who has taken their time to tell us how Bob has continued to impact their lives in one way or another. And so we hope that you've learned a bit and can think of these people not just as, gee, dad / siblings / whatever is just a celebrity, and this is what comes with it. What comes with it is human beings who have real thoughts, feelings, and love. And if we can help those people to be thought of more in that light, then we'll keep working.
Flipside, the true story of Bob Crane, is owned and produced by Carol M. Ford Productions and is based on Bob Crane, the definitive biography. All rights reserved. No portion of the podcast may be used without written permission. Audio clips of Robert Scott Crane were told exclusively to Linda Groundwater and Carol Ford and are copyrighted to Linda and Carol. Unauthorized use of these clips is strictly forbidden.
For archived episodes of this podcast and for more information about Bob Crane, visit voteforbobcrane.org. That's vote, the number 4, bobcrane.org. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn Radio, our hosting site Spreaker, and everywhere podcasts are found.